Do you upload photos or videos to the internet? Do you have an ISP? Do you like monkeys? Then you're going to want to join us on This Week in Law with Professor John Tehranian, cyber lawyer Kevin Thompson, and cyber macaque Evan Brown next.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiL.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell, episode 120, recorded July 15, 2011. Colorado Grandmothers for 200, Alex. This episode of This Week in Law is brought to you by Squarespace.com, the fast and easy way to create a high-quality website or blog. For a free trial and 10% off your new account for 6 months, go to Squarespace.com and use offer code TWiL7. And by Netflix, with thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or TV instantly, all streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. Hey folks, you've tuned in for This Week in Law. I'm Denise Howell, and we've got a great panel of folks for you today and some really interesting stuff to talk about. With us is Professor John Tehranian from Southwestern Law School. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
Doing great. Also joining us again on TWiL is Kevin Thompson, the cyber lawyer. Hi, Kevin. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, Denise. Thanks so much for having me back on.
Great to have you on. Also joining us once again is Evan Brown. Hello, Evan.
Well, hello, and happy Friday. It's great to be here, as usual.
Great to have you. So we've got all kinds of great stuff to discuss this week, and I'm hoping to sort of thread it all together. I can see common themes going through much of it. Let's start with music, since we had Spotify finally come to the U.S. this week. And interesting sort of landscape out there in the cloud music arena right now, with Spotify having jumped through all the licensing hurdles, despite its past and the past of its founders in more of the BitTorrent arena. And we've got Amazon and Google, on the other hand, not having gone through any formal licensing process with the record labels, and Apple on the side of definitely getting their licensing ducks in a row and paying a bunch of upfront money. So we've got all these options out there. There's still questions about what's legal and what's not legal, and the case against MP3 tunes grinds along. John is the author of a really interesting book called Infringement Nation that I encourage people to pick up. And a big theme of that book is how just your everyday life can involve a lot of copyright infringement. So I guess uploading music to the cloud and playing it in other locations and on other devices falls into that kind of a category. John, what's your take on all these cloud music services and where things stand right now?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the contrast we're seeing in the strategy between what Apple is doing, which is going with the licensing model first and then putting up their service, versus what Amazon and Google are doing, which is, basically saying, okay, we're going to take our chances. We think we're in the clear, but we're not going to get a license, and we're going to go ahead and try to use that then as leverage against the music studios, the music recording companies, to get a license. It's fairly interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, on an individual level, from the point of view of copyright law, effectively, according to the stand taken by the recording industry, what these users are doing individually by putting their music in the cloud is potentially an infringement. It's an unauthorized reproduction, certainly, one that is arguably fair use, but it's interesting to see if the recording industry is going to respond with potentially going after Amazon and Google, or even going after end users, something they have done in the past but have backed off of recently.
Yep. Has anyone tried Spotify? Are you planning to make this a part of your music diet, Kevin?
I certainly would give it a chance if I had an invite. So far, nobody's given me one. My understanding, it's still very much exclusive as to who gets on it right now. But I certainly wouldn't mind giving it a try. I personally I'm sort of curious how everything's going to work out with the iCloud and the iTunes in the cloud. That's probably more likely what I personally will end up using. But yeah, I really think some of the articles that we had had for discussion today, sort of nailed it pretty well in terms of the different routes that these people have taken to license their service or not, and we'll have to see which one prevails.
Well, we had a decision on not a music locker site, but one that was used more for video that was called HotFile, I believe, where there's a federal copyright infringement case pending in Miami, and part of the case has been dismissed and part of it can proceed. The part that's been dismissed is the allegation of direct infringement against HotFile. The court didn't buy into the fact that a company could be held liable for direct infringement simply because its users are uploading things that are perhaps, Hollywood-esque movies. Let's see. The judge specifically said that infringement requires a volitional act by the infringer, and here there's no search and no pointing people toward what might be infringing materials on the service. On the other hand, though, the indirect liability, the Grokster-esque liability, if you will, is proceeding, and that part of the case will go forward. So it's somewhat informative for these lockering services who are hoping, I believe, to be able to fall into a safe harbor and say that this is just our users' activity, it's not us, and we're not inducing them to infringe, so we can't be held liable. Evan, any thoughts on this as it shades the music service arena?
Right. I'm not so sure it should give the file locker service owners, much solace, because it really seems self-evident to me that the big risk that they face is one for secondary infringement liability. With HotFile here, I don't think this decision is all that surprising that they're not liable directly for infringement. And what that is a fancy way of saying is that they are not responsible for actually committing copyright themselves, but copyright infringement themselves, but the question remains open as to whether they would be liable for the copyright infringement that's being committed by those who are using it. And ever since June of 2005, when Grokster came out, and up to leading up to that point, and as much as one was reading into the anticipated decision as focusing on this inducement theory of liability for copyright infringement, there's this extra stuff that goes on the part of the service provider or the platform provider, whether it be something like a P2P network or a file sharing service, that gives rise to that secondary liability. And it appears that in this case with HotFile, and maybe with some of these other file locker services, that there is a real effort on the part of the owners of this service, to the purveyors of these services, to encourage people to do this stuff. And I don't understand all the details to it, but my impression is that there was some kind of reward system here for having people share these files, and people were rewarded if a lot of other people shared them here. And so this decision here, if I were HotFile, I wouldn't think that this was much of a victory, because the more difficult and problematic part of the case is still present, and that's where the exciting stuff is going to happen in this case, on that question of secondary liability for copyright infringement.
Yeah, and Denise, I actually want to just echo what Evan said. I think that's completely correct. I think, the ruling was fairly non-surprising. It was just an early, motion dismiss where the court found that there was no volitional direct infringement by HotFile. But the outstanding issue with respect to secondary liability is a big one, and suggests, what we're seeing in the post-Grokster environment, which is that companies can no longer necessarily take a lot of solace in what was known as the Sony safe harbor, of course, from the famous VCR case involving Sony versus Universal, where the court found that a technology with substantial non-infringing use could be protected from secondary liability. Here with HotFile, arguably there is substantial non-infringing use as well as infringing use, but Grokster allows liability questions to remain by looking at the extent to which Grokster effectively induced liability. And it's important to note that the implications are broader than just the file lockers like HotFile, for example,
Sure.
new popular service like Dropbox, for example, that a lot of people use for collaborative efforts. Arguably, that's nothing more than a glorified music locker or potential music locker, and services like Dropbox, if there's liability against HotFile, could also face similar suits.
John, do you think that those sorts of services are going to have to implement the kind of measures that YouTube has as far as digital IDs and fingerprinting, trying to filter out infringing works? They haven't really, gotten to that point in their development yet.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure. In part, it's political to make sure that they're looking like good citizens and good players and working with industry as opposed to potentially against industry. I think it helps bolster their legal position also. But ultimately, you're going to end up seeing more checks on the ability of users to use Dropbox services and things like that in an unadulterated way. And depending on your perspective, that might be a good thing. But I think that's going to unequivocally be the case.
Right. Evan, one of the questions that comes up a lot regarding the iTunes Match service, which hasn't launched yet, which we'll see later on this fall, is whether it's going to be used to finger people who have large libraries of illegally downloaded music that they're now wanting to access through the iTunes service. You got interviewed on that point. You want to share your insights with us?
Yeah, I talked to our friend Chris Forsman, who is a friend of our show here on TWiL. He writes for Ars Technica, and he did a great piece about examining the question of, and this was actually a question that came up very early on back in March when we started talking about all of these different services. Is would the record labels go after the users, alleging that they were engaged in piracy using these services? And that question came to a very fine point with the launch of Apple's iCloud service, because of the question of this, what they were calling kind of amnesty or whatever. So a couple of important points on this. First, it would not be in Apple's best interest to cooperate with the anti-piracy efforts of the big record labels, because there's nothing to be gained on Apple's perspective. In my view, it would only scare people away from the service, thinking, oh, come here, and you're just essentially putting your misdeeds under a spotlight, and we're going to turn you over and sell you down the river. That would not be a good way to get new users and new customers of the service. The other kind of salient point that I see in this is that the investigatory process that the labels would have to go through to identify potential defendants, alleged infringers, is much more opaque in a siloed kind of system like the Apple, the iCloud service, and Amazon. For some reason, I'm having a hard time getting all these names straight today. I'm having some kind of dissonance with that. Google Music and all these stuff. There are these silos. It's not like the open web or the internet, where there's a certain protocol that's being used, whether it be BitTorrent or some other P2P protocol for sharing all these things. It's much more siloed, and so you would need the cooperation of the service providers even to identify the alleged infringers, the potential defendants. And so there, for the same reasons, there's an obstacle to the investigatory process. So on balance, I would not be very worried about using one of these services to put me more at risk of becoming a John Doe defendant and ultimately a named defendant in some kind of lawsuit brought by the record labels. Accompanying all of this is the fact that seems to be the shift, that strategy seems to be moving out of the picture here, as the record labels are taking other strategies to deal with piracy rather than suing individuals. So and that was what Chris and I talked about in that Ars Technica piece.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kevin.
The one thing I was thinking more about that, though, is it's not that Apple may not voluntarily cooperate with an investigation, but that simply might be a data silo, a data repository, such that they would be the subject of a subpoena from one of the record labels, sort of a third-party subpoena target in one of these, and they might simply have to turn over, their username and records.
All right, so maybe we're not too concerned about getting hunted down and brought to task for our large illegal music libraries in using iTunes Match. But suppose you have a large library and you choose one of these services, a really large library, like Seattle resident Andre Vrino, for example. And you sign up, as I did for Spotify this weekend. Oh, by the way, I should interject, Kevin, if you're still looking around for Spotify invites, or if anyone listening or watching is, the IRC has ridden to our rescue. If you're watching live, log into irc.twit.tv, and some folks have been posting links to where you can get Spotify invitations. Also, if you're following Lewis Gray on Google+, he has, I think, an unlimited invite link that he's posted there, and that's how I got mine. Anyway, digression aside, we've got Andre Vrino, who's perhaps signed up for Spotify. Actually, I think this was a while ago, so it was one of the other services, and uploaded his huge library to the cloud, and found that, to his surprise and dismay, when he did so, he went over his 250 gigabyte data cap on Comcast, triggering a 1-year-long ban from using its services. So poor Andre, who shares his web connection with roommates, etc., they are just out in the cold. And, of course, this is all disclosed in the documentation for residential accounts with Comcast, but not disclosed terribly visibly. And if you go to Andre's blog, he has a nice little graphic of, when you go through the sign-up process for your Comcast cable service, they really emphasize what you're going to get on the download side and don't emphasize how much you're going to be capped on the upload side. So I raised this on This Week in Law because I think, we're starting to get into an area where you're yanking people's internet away from them based on the fine print in their agreements, where you might start to see some anger and dismay on the part of consumer protection organizations. Maybe we'll see some lawsuits about this. It comes down to a terms of service issue. John, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this raises a broader question, which is to what extent is internet access or broadband internet access almost a human right or a digital necessity in the information age? To many people, internet access is their digital lifeline, and so if it is cut off, it's akin to being cut off from heating services or electricity services or telephone services back in the old days, I don't think the U.S. has taken the stand that the UN has taken, which is that unequivocally, internet access is akin to a human right. But depending on the way we conceptualize internet access, that may lead us to want to increase protections that prevent the cutoff of internet access without some kind of procedural mechanism, something akin to due process before these rights are taken away from individuals. And that, of course, leads to an issue with respect to, I think we'll be discussing later, which is, procedures for cutting off people's internet access, not just when they violate terms of service, but if they're infringers, for example. So I think all of that leads to a broader debate about how important is the internet to functioning in society in the 21st century, and to what extent are we going to put in procedural mechanisms to prevent people from being arbitrarily cut off or unfairly cut off from their internet access.
Right. Kevin, what do you think? Are these bandwidth caps? First of all, I just don't know how much sense they make in the era where we're not just downloading and consuming things, but also actively uploading things, either for our own personal use or for the professional work we do at home. And I suppose we might get into issues with other limitations on the commercial use of your residential account that could be in this documentation. But just sticking right now with the bandwidth cap, do you think that's kind of thing is going to stand? Do you think we're going to see class actions about this? What do you predict?
I certainly think that class actions are certainly possible. There are terms of service that have been changed, and if you want to continue with your service, you've got to go with it and keep using that particular company. Sometimes you don't have a whole lot of choice. Sometimes you only have one particular broadband provider in your area, and so you may not have a choice to switch, which is unfortunate. Personally, I think my terms of service with I think we use AT&T Uverse. I think those have recently got data caps on there as well, and so that makes me nervous because I personally have also signed up for web services like Carbonite and so forth that do trickle up to the cloud, and we use services like Netflix to stream movies. And if my kids should happen to watch the same Pokemon movie over and over and over again, there goes my data cap.
Yeah, it seems to me like these things are going to have to be brought into connection with reality. Evan, if someone sues over this kind of thing, is that a taco suit?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with what John said, and I don't think any reasonable person would, and Kevin was echoing this, and I think we're all sensible enough to know how important internet access is to a free society and promoting the ideals of democracy and free speech and all that stuff. That's obvious. Nobody's going to dispute that. But this guy he's in Seattle, this guy that we're talking about, Andre Vignaud. I mean, he's loving this. He's got Wired writing about him. We're talking about him here on TWiL. His picture is real big on the Epicenter blog over on Wired. I mean, just go ahead and insert the appropriate metaphor here. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, or pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered. This guy was using 40 to 50 times the average bandwidth compared to the average, broadband consumer. He was uploading all these raw files. His images were in raw. All these fully encoded, uncompressed formats that he was using. I mean, the larger question here is, what does it mean to be a responsible citizen when we're using services? If everybody's going to be, using this much of our network's capacity, there's going to be instability. And, I have every bit of my support is behind the overall principles of, yes, we need to ensure free access and equal access and unmitigated access to the internet and to the overall network. But come on, I don't have much sympathy for this guy here. I'm sorry, I just don't.
Okay, well, do you have sympathy for Chris Pirillo, who had a back and forth with Comcast Bill on Twitter that he posted up to Google Plus this morning? Somebody's going to have to explain to me what the difference is between a 5010 user as a 10510 user. I don't know if that's what account you're on or how it describes, how much usage you're actually making of your service. But Chris starts out by asking Comcast, why is there the same artificial 250 gigabyte cap for a 5010 user, up and down data cap I'm getting from the studio, as there is for a 10510 user? And then Comcast Bill comes back to him and says, residential services all have the same cap. Our business services, on the other hand, do not have any data cap. Chris says, of course, they're also outrageously priced for home office users. You need a middle tier. Comcast Bill says, the residential broadband customers get 250 gigabytes a month. We notify everyone of any excessive usage, which is less than 1% of the people, to which Chris replies, and how many of those people are on the 10510 at this point? You kept the cap at the same level and increased the cost and speed. And then Comcast Bill says you download 62,500 songs, download 125 standard definition movies at 2 gigabytes a movie, and upload 25,000 high-resolution digital photos, to which Chris says, or, use Dropbox with other people to push legitimate video around. You're peddling spin, Bill, and I don't swallow it. And I think that gets back to Kevin's point about, his kids watching a couple of Pokemon movies. It really, I don't think, is that outrageously hard to hit one of these bandwidth caps in this day and age. So that's why, I think there's some tension here that needs to be resolved. And this strikes me as just another way, and I'd love to hear John's take on this, that, we see so many salvos, multi-fronted attack from the entertainment industry on things moving around legitimately or not so legitimately on the web. And these bandwidth caps just seem to me another, sort of clandestine salvo in that front. John, do you think that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, I do. I think that is a fair characterization, although I think that's in some ways changing. Historically, or at least in the last few years, where there was extensive bandwidth use, typically the industry could associate it, more times than not, with illicit activity, right? So if there was high bandwidth use, it was someone on BitTorrent or someone engaging in illegal peer-to-peer file sharing that was using up or hogging bandwidth. So by cracking down on bandwidth excess, that was effectively a proxy for cracking down on piracy, at least the way the entertainment industry saw it. But increasingly, high bandwidth use is associated with legitimate activity. So, for example, the leading user or the leading source of high bandwidth use these days is Netflix. But people who are using Netflix are doing so legitimately. They're paying a monthly fee and they're getting licensed movies. And so I don't think in the future it's going to be as easy for the industry to say, okay, high bandwidth use, that's a proxy for piracy, so we need to crack down on it. That said, though, there is an increasing movement to toll services like Netflix for basically using a good portion of internet bandwidth for their services, and that's really the next battleground, which is that the internet is it's a huge resource, but in some ways it is a scarce resource. In the sense that that bandwidth is limited, although it feels close to unlimited, it is limited. And so anytime you give unlimited access to a limited resource, there are going to be economic tensions, and sooner or later there's going to be a push for a model where people are not given unlimited access, and there are going to be tiers of access. And of course that leads to issues like net neutrality and other concerns about equity and whether you want to create effectively the internet haves and the internet have-nots, but there is some rational economic argument to the idea of regulating the resource in a way that not everybody gets unlimited access to use all you can want, because you don't want situations of abusive use.
Right, and I haven't caught yesterday's Tech News Today yet, but Zcam in our IRC points out that a listener called into that show to let them know that Comcast was throttling him and warned him he'd be shut off because he was restoring a Carbonite backup. He told him to download slowly over a few months. That's going to work really well. Okay, so we've got a couple of other salvos more direct on from the entertainment industry on nefarious or, starting to get into not nefarious at all online activity. But before we get into those, I want to thank the first of our sponsors for episode 120 of This Week in Law, and that is Squarespace. Squarespace is the fast and easy way to create a high-quality website or blog. It has an easy-to-use UI for creating and managing a website or blog. It's optimized for both beginners and CSS experts. And as someone who I think is somewhere in the middle of those two things, it is just a joy to use. I have my own blog there, my own site, bagandbaggage.com. And just in the last few weeks, since I've completely gotten sucked into Google Plus, and really I'm looking forward to reading John's book once I get off Google Plus long enough to pay attention to an actual printed book, because it just sounds amazing. But one of the things I wanted to do with my Squarespace blog is go ahead and add a +1 button to it and do some other tweaks. And I just can't tell you how easy it makes it for someone who's not, super web design, web construction technical to inject a bit of code into the HTML of your site. They actually use the term inject, which I like, sort of clean and hypodermic. And once it's there, it functions just great, and you've added new functionality to your site without any kind of real burden or headache on your part. It also looks great. Hundreds of design templates to choose from, and you can customize any of those designs to fit your needs. There are iPhone and iPad apps that make it really seamless to keep track of your site and update it on the go. Online resources and a special support team that give you personal help 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. This all-inclusive service includes several modules to build your website. The blog module lets you import and export from other services such as WordPress, Blogger, Movable Type, and TypePad. There's a form builder to collect email addresses and other information from site visitors, Flickr photo display, Twitter and other social widgets, and media buttons to connect your website out to all the networks out there, Google Maps, and more. There's tracking so you know how many times your site is viewed, who's viewing it, all that good stuff. Plus built-in SEO, you know, that can be kind of a dirty term, but what they do is just make your site the best possible result for what's being searched for out there in all the right ways. Permission access handling, cloud architecture for speed and site stability. So use it. It's Squarespace. It's great for all your website needs. You can build, host, and update anytime. And get over there at squarespace.com. You can sign right up for a free account. There's no credit card needed. Just try it out and start building your own site. Then if you decide to purchase it, use the offer code squarespace.com/TWiL7, TWiL7, and that will get you exactly 10% off your account for 6 months. So squarespace.com/TWiL7, and we really thank them for their support. All right, so one way that the ISPs have been affirmatively working with the entertainment industry is this new Six Strikes copyright enforcement plan, and I encourage folks who did not listen to last Sunday's TWiT to tune in for their discussion of that. Leo called it death by a thousand notices, death by a thousand advisements, whatever it is they're sending to you, because they just keep notifying you that you've run afoul of some kind of copyright detection until finally they put you into copyright re-education. It's all very sort of Big Brother sounding. Kevin, have you looked at this, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly have looked at it. I've got a copy right here on my pad of the ways that you can try to get around the allegation. I sort of have a problem from a first standpoint of the fact that this is a system that it's not judicial. Is merely there are allegations that are made of copyright infringement, and then it puts the onus on the user to come forward with an explanation of either why copyright infringement doesn't apply, such as fair use or wrong identification. But there's a procedure that involves the user paying a $35 fee for this panel to look at it. And then there are 6 ways that they can get around it. One is misidentification of account, that they got the wrong guy, that there was unauthorized use of which the subscriber was unaware, but you can only use that one once. You can't say each time that you were unaware. You can only use that once.
So that's your open Wi-Fi defense right there?
Yeah, you can use that one once, and after that, you better have it locked down. Otherwise, they won't let you use that one again.
There's a great rundown of all this from Nate Anderson over at Ars Technica. The 6 ways.
That's actually what I'm looking at here.
Yeah, new copyright mitigation measures. So he sort of takes you through. And by the way, it was death by 1,000 alerts. Thank you, Daddy-O in the IRC, which I just loved. So if you're getting on the receiving end of these 1,000 alerts, you need to check out Nate's article for all the various ways you can respond, including you're basically paying yet another fee to your ISP to even have this looked at further. Is that what I'm to understand, Kevin?
Right. You can get it looked at, and then I think there's this, if they believe your excuse, I think you get your $35 back.
Well, that's kind of them. John, what do you think of all this?
Very, very troubling. I mean, on one hand, I think obviously copyright infringement is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. On the other hand, there's some real concerns about the procedural mechanisms, as mentioned earlier. There's the question of who is adjudicating these cases. They're obviously extrajudicial, so they're taking place in some kind of non-court. There are no due process protections. There's the risk of losing your service without having a a real judicial hearing. And of course, this has been a system that's organized by the copyright holders, and so there's every reason to believe that their interpretation of copyright law is going to predominate. Unfortunately, that interpretation of copyright law is a very extreme one. It's one that regards very little as fair use. It regards almost any use of someone's work as per se an act of infringement. That believes that something as simple as making a copy of your own music library could potentially be infringing. And so that potentially leads to a lot of people facing a lot of problems with losing something that, as I discussed earlier, is the equivalent of a digital lifeline in today's society. And I think this also highlights another danger that we haven't talked about. It's a little out of the scope of our issues, but it's, I think, a subtext, which is it shows some of the danger in having a concentrated telecommunications services market. The very fact that there are only a few major providers now of broadband internet access suggests that they can easily be corralled together with the recording industry and the motion picture industry and engage in deals like this. It'll be interesting to see if the market is functioning in kind of an unfettered way, whether competitors will evolve, broadband services will evolve and say, listen, we're not part of this cartel. We are not going to subscribe to this extrajudicial process of shutting down your internet, and we provide internet service. If they have a problem, if the recording industry has a problem with how we provide it, we'll go to court, or they can take you to court, but we're not going to take independent action outside of the judicial process. I'm not sure we're going to see that because the market is so concentrated. So it suggests another concern to be aware of.
Evan, we've talked about this before on the show before it was actually announced and implemented, and we're cautiously hopeful that perhaps in its implementation it would be a nice compromise to the three strikes plan that was being bandied about last year, where you would actually get kicked off the service. This doesn't kick you off the service, but seems to mire you in an endless sea of red tape and headache. What's your take on the final version of this system?
Right. It's yet another example of a situation that just kind of outlines the contours of a larger problem, and that is this problem of reasonably accessible and affordable due process. That seems to be the knee-jerk reaction that we all have when we hear about these things is, oh, this is extrajudicial. This is all in the back pocket of the content industry. This is the result of, this is a negative consequence of a concentrated telecommunications market, as John is pointing out. All those are very valid and fundamental and indeed very strong, troubling things. But what we have those discussions about those things, and we recognize those as problems, as if to suggest that if there was some kind of reliable and easily accessible and affordable due process mechanism to adjudicate these things, all would be well with the world, and we wouldn't worry about this, and we would think, oh, everything's just going to get back into equilibrium and nobody's rights are going to be trampled upon or any of that stuff. Setting aside for a moment, I just wonder how much of a real problem this is. Are there really a lot of people who are getting hassled by their ISPs? And I'm looking weird on the video there. I see for a second. For those who are watching, must be something with my ISP.
Exactly. You're answering your own question.
Right. Okay, there. I'm better. So one of the problems that's just presented to by implication is, what kind of forum can we go into and have these kinds of disputes or these problems resolved so that we can be ensured due process without the expense and the hassle and the inaccessibility of the court system? Is there anything to be learned, on that whole other aspect or component of this whole story? That's the rhetorical question that I have.
Well, I think, I just want to address that. I think Evan brings up a very good point, but I think there have been instances already documented of individuals having their internet access cut off. There's an example of Kathy Paradiso, a grandmother from Pueblo, Colorado, a few years ago, whose internet service provider, Quest, actually terminated or threatened to terminate her account, claiming she'd illegally downloaded multiple movies. It turns out the movies that she had supposedly downloaded were South Park and Zombieland. Now, most grandmothers I know aren't big fans of either South Park or Zombieland, and of course,
she's in Colorado.
Well, you never know. That's true. That's true. Maybe she was an alternative thinker. But she pled with them to take them off her do not give internet access list too, and said she's never downloaded a movie, period, let alone Zombieland or South Park. But the complaint she had fell on deaf ears until she actually took her story to the press and got some traction there. But for her ISP was her digital lifeline. It was she was an artist that works at home on her computer, and her livelihood depended on it. And any kind of interference, even if for a few days, cost her significant amounts of money, and suggests that there are problems potentially with the procedures that have been put in place or being talked about.
Yeah, we hear from Reverb Mike in the IRC. He says he gets a menacing note, or she says they get a menacing note each month from their ISP, the reason being Netflix. And I can definitely see that my own internet usage at home, where I've gone ahead and sprung for business class cable, because I do this show from home and want it really more about reliability than wanting to have, an absence of caps. I have Time Warner as my ISP at home, and I think Time Warner went through this a while back and decided, they tried out some caps, and there was such an outcry that they decided to back off that. So I don't know even if their residential customers are capped at this point, but, the business customers presumably are not at all. But I think, on any other residential cap kind of scenario, between my Pandora use and my Netflix use and Amazon Instant Video use and just using, we have a Mac Mini hooked up to the TV and do a lot of Hulu and other stuff that way, that we would rapidly come up against a 250 gigabyte cap, and also probably scrutiny about what we were doing with all that activity. And so, I could readily see getting into this whole death by 1,000 alerts scenario and not enjoying it at all. So I don't think it's a necessarily positive development. I'm glad that people are not getting kicked off, but it's perhaps not as scary, at least at first blush, as the Felony Streaming and Embedding Act, something that has been pending since May in Congress and has been endorsed in hearings by our new copyright register, Maria Palante, who thinks it's a good idea. John, you want to tell us exactly what this act is and if it's as scary as it sounds, and I'll preface that for anyone who hasn't heard of it yet. It sounds as though if you are embedding or streaming something that is infringing, and particularly this is frightening on the embedding front, say, for example, you are someone like Eileen, our producer here at TWiT, who over in her Google Plus stream posted up this awesome video of Electra Woman and Dyna Girl from the 70s. Just, absolutely made my day to see this blast from the past, Marty Krofft production, etc. And I'm sure, there she is, Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. It doesn't. I'm not hearing the audio, but I'll provide that for you. It's part of my DNA. There she is.
A lot of those production values.
That is just, some of the best video I've seen online in a long time. You can totally see why Eileen would choose to embed this and point to it. But by doing so, this is copyrighted work that she is not licensed to. She is not necessarily commenting on it except to say it's amazing. And so, I don't think she'd have much of a fair use contention. Just embedding it and on her way. Is she the kind of person who's going to run afoul, and are we, now that we've put it on the show, of this Felony Streaming and Embedding Act? What do you think, John?
Well, luckily, I think you know a few good copyright attorneys who can defend the lawsuit that may be filed against you on this. But yeah, I mean, look, one of the problems is with respect to any use of copyrighted materials. I mean, we live in an age where we all have a digital printing press in our homes that's globally networked, and we're constantly manipulating content. And ever since the passage of the 1976 Copyright Act, the default rule in copyright laws, the second something's created, it's copyright protected. And increasingly, the default rule has been if you're using someone's copyrighted work without permission, you potentially face very, very draconian statutory damage penalties of up to $150,000 per willful act. And the new proposed Felony Streaming Act adds to this kind of trend of increasing these draconian penalties. Its intentions may be right in the sense that it's intended to target only commercial users that are willfully engaging in copyright infringement of economically significant works and are doing thousands and thousands of dollars of damage to those works. But when you get down to the fine print in the proposed statute, and then you think about the history of judicial interpretation of some of the acts that have come before the Felony Streaming Act, where something that may start off as simply attaching to broad-scale pirates, people who are fully streaming in perfect HD a Hollywood movie, you can see that the enforcement oftentimes then leaks down to individuals who were certainly not originally contemplated, and we see that with the commercial. Or rather, the criminal copyright penalties currently. For years, they were not really enforced. They were meant to really be enforced against broad-scale bootleggers. But in recent years, they've gone after bloggers who might put up a leaked version of Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses, and then find the feds knocking on their doors and threatening them with a few years in a federal penitentiary. The problem is the language in these acts is often broadly written. The interpretation of economic damage is often broadly interpreted, and as a result, many uses which could in fact be fair use, or even if they're not fair use, are really in some ways de minimis in terms of the real economic damages, can result in people facing a felony, and a felony is nothing to scoff at. I mean, that's a serious penalty that can absolutely ruin people's lives, and it seems draconian. So I think it's something to be definitely concerned about.
Yeah, it strikes me as, they're coming out and the new copyright register coming out and saying, the purpose of this is to go after the really big, terrible incidents of infringement. But if that's the case, then I'd like to see the statute a lot more narrowly tailored. Evan, any thoughts?
I don't. I'm already getting hazed by the IRC today for taking all this big pro-business stance and pro-copyright owner stance and all this stuff. But I'll just go ahead and continue the trend. Fine. I think the statute is pretty narrowly drafted. It has to consist of 10 or more public performances, and I guess there may be some ambiguity as to what that means. Do 10 people have to see it, or does it have to be 10 different videos during a 6-month period? So it's got to be concentrated. Let's say of one or more copyrighted works. So that would suggest it's got to be, more than one video rather than, 10 people looking at it. There's got to be a really high retail value of that, the total economic value has to exceed $2,500, and the total fair market value of the licenses would be $5,000. So this is not going to, I just don't see any set of facts where this is going to encompass the casual YouTube embedder. The example that you gave with Dyna Girl, before just a few minutes ago. I mean, that doesn't seem like it would fall in here. That's not. Well,
I don't know. Eileen's got 32 plus ones and 13 shares on that particular video. Who knows who else has seen it? So those are at least some evidence of the public performance and redistribution of that. And then we've got Sanford and Son, a little clip from that a little further down below. So I think, if it is going to be on a video by video, it's not hard to get to 10. It gives me pause. Kevin, what do you think?
I think I'm just about the only linker that this might possibly be applied to. It would be the person who actually first put it up on YouTube, as opposed to the person that later links to it. I just don't see it. I just don't see this particular act applying to the casual linker.
But it is for embedding. right? Isn't that what casual linking is all about?
Right, but I think just reading the wording of the act, I just see it applying more for the particular person who's doing the actual uploading, who's doing the actual putting it up there, and perhaps the first embed on their site versus someone who is just merely linking to YouTube and using their embedding function.
Right. Okay, well, I want to move on and talk about some photography-related stories and some privacy-related stories. But before we get to that, I'd like to thank our second sponsor for this show, which is presumably pushing us all over our bandwidth caps, and that's Netflix. Netflix streams thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to you instantly, which means it saves you time, money, and hassle. There are several easy ways to instantly access streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. You can watch Netflix movies and TV shows on your computer, your Mac, your PC, your iPad. The iPad app is really wonderful. You can watch on your phone and some Android phones too. You have a gaming console, the Xbox 360, the PS3, or the Nintendo Wii. All of them support Netflix Instant right to your TV. And if you're not a gamer, you can watch Netflix on your TV with an Apple TV box, a Roku box. Lots of DVD players have Netflix built right into them now. They're inexpensive and easy to use. And you can watch movies and TV shows instantly using any of these devices. And you can begin watching a movie or show on one device and then go into another room and you have another Netflix-enabled device in there, or you're out on the road and you have your iPad. You can pull it up right there and finish watching. Whichever way you choose to access Netflix, you can watch as many movies and TV shows as you want, anytime you want, and you can cancel at any time. Go to netflix.com/twit and you can try it today for 30 days free. Be sure to use that URL when you sign up, and we thank Netflix for their support of This Week in Law and the TWiT Network, and we hope you enjoy watching instantly with Netflix. All right, so let's talk about, we were talking about terms of use in terms of ISPs. Let's talk about terms of use in terms of social networks. I alluded to the fact of the new one on the block, the new big kid on the block, Google+, which I am sorry to say is just sucking me out of all kinds of other fully joyful and more life-enhancing, presumably, activities. And it also is causing, you throw a new social network out there and people are going to start wondering about how its terms of use affect them and the things that they're putting into it. This is really Google's first venture into having people upload to their service, other than YouTube, of course, which has a whole different array of terms of service that do not apply at the moment to Google+, and I must say are far more draconian than what I'm seeing in the general terms of use over at Google that do apply to Google+. So presumably when this is released to the public, we're going to see Google tweaking and adding things both on the privacy front and the terms of use front. But in the meantime, there's been a lot of talk among photographers about whether Google+ is a good place for them to post their works. We mentioned this last week, talked about Scott Bourne noticing the excellent point that, whenever you upload to a service that makes you grant them a non-exclusive license to be able to use your works to move them around on the service and share them with other users and otherwise make their sharing service a sharing service, you're granting them a license. And if it's part of your bread and butter to grant an exclusive license to your clients as a photographer, for example, you can't grant them an exclusive license if you're already granting licenses around to social networks. It just is, cognitive dissonance there. But a lot of people wanted to take a look and see, further on the Google terms. I did over at my site at Bag & Baggage an examination of those terms and my thoughts on them. The one thing that I really like about the Google terms of use as they stand now for a social network is there's a nice limitation, a nice statement of purpose of what the user license is intended to cover. And it does limit the use that Google plans to make of the things that are licensed to it, to what's necessary to run their service, and they throw in something that's a little bit more problematic, and that they also throw into the purpose, promotional use, without defining that. So it's a nice object lesson in how it's good to take a look at these terms and to compare them. Over on Facebook, for example, they took a ton of flack, and if you Google something like Facebook rights grab, you'll find all the articles from, I forget if it was '08 or '09, when people took a close look at the Facebook terms of service, or they altered, I think, their terms of service and took out revocability and various things, and then had to backtrack. The Facebook terms are revocable. The user license goes away when you take your work out of there or cancel your account, except to the extent that they've been shared with others. So, there are exceptions to that. But the Google ones are not, and that's causing some people concern and consternation. I think that's somewhat modified or levied by this statement of purpose that we're only going to use the stuff you give us to help us run the service and share it around. So I toss this out to you guys. Kevin, if you want to start, what's your overall take on the Google terms from a social networking standpoint?
Well, I didn't think they were particularly onerous. I thought they were fairly straightforward and, real similar to what other services would necessarily have to have. I mean, if they're going to put it up on their site, they're going to need a license, a non-exclusive license, hopefully, which is what they have here, to put it up and display it. Otherwise, that they couldn't have it. And I think Scott Bourne's point about the fact that photographers need an exclusive license to be able to grant to their customers. If somebody buys a photograph from a professional photographer, they've got a reasonable expectation that they were going to have an exclusive license for it, and it's not something that the photographer is going to himself be sharing or himself be putting up on a social sharing site like that, because that's sort of their expectation. So I agree that it is a concern, but I don't know what sharing site that Scott Bourne could ever actually use. If it's a photo that he's going to potentially be concerned about having the ability to grant an exclusive license for. So, overall, I liked, Google Plus. I've been playing around with it a little bit. I know you're in one of my circles, Denise. So,
absolutely. And Evan, you're not in any of ours yet. Are you just eschewing social media entirely? Are you kicking them cold turkey at this point?
Yes. At this point, I've been having some moral panics over it. So that's, yeah.
All right. Well, we can't have panic, moral or otherwise, but the point about these terms is, as I said in my post, I don't think they're necessarily panic-worthy. I do think that we might see some adjustments to them as the service actually rolls out of its 10 million user plus beta trial period and into public release. John?
Yeah, Denise, let me add that, I mean, Google's damned if they do, damned if they don't. I mean, they have to put some of these terms in there. It's just required. Otherwise, they're going to face potentially a stream of litigation down the road. And because of the massive penalties for copyright infringement, they'd be looking at massive amounts of liability. So it's completely understandable. I think what's interesting with these terms of use debates is actually there's a very constructive public dialogue that occurs where there's almost this quasi-negotiation that occurs. It's not ex ante. It's sort of after the fact, but there's a revision process that almost occurs. It's almost like a collective bargaining situation. And so in some ways the fact that people are paying attention to this stuff is a very healthy sign of a marketplace, and the fact that people call out Google or Facebook in the past and Facebook then will alter their terms suggests that there is a decent amount of back and forth here. And I think Google may revisit this issue of revocability as Facebook did, and it wouldn't be surprising to see some changes.
Right. Evan, any thoughts on the terms or social media terms of use and user licenses in general?
I like the point that you made about Google's terms of service in particular, about this problem of syndication, which is something that's very essential to all these things. I'm trying to pull up exactly what you read. The terms of service lets Google make the users grant Google a license to make their content available to other companies, organizations, individuals, with whom Google has relationships for the provision of syndicated services. And so you raise this great question. What does syndication mean? That term is undefined. Does it mean an API call? Does it mean RSS and Atom? So this is something that we could have been discussing 5 years ago, this question of what it means to be syndicated. And so I think it would be a really interesting process to try to define what that means, and if that could really be done in a way that is not going to be too constrictive of future technologies that facilitate the sharing of this content, which is so integral to what it's all about. So that would be a really big challenge for a drafts person to try to address, precisely what's meant by syndication. We just kind of know it when we see it.
Right. Yeah, it comes down to 3 ticks for me. One is that point, Evan, defining that term. The other is defining this term promotion, what they're going to do with your stuff for promotional purposes, or hopefully putting some kind of, if they need to maintain that in there, putting some kind of more fine-grained user controls over, okay, this picture of the sunset that I took, is okay if you want to use it to promote the service, but not necessarily this picture of my kid in the bath, or something along those lines. Let people opt out. And then finally, I think this whole, revocation, how the license goes away, because right now it endures as long as the copyrighted work itself does that you upload. It's a non-revocable license. I'd like to see them revisit that and see, particularly given that we're talking about one of the most sophisticated companies on the planet from an engineering standpoint, perhaps there could be a means of extracting out what a user has put in, that it's not terribly complicated to be able to remove their works and revoke their license if they decide to close their account. So love to see them give some consideration to those points. So can we go back to Colorado grandmothers for a moment? Actually, I'm not sure that...
one of my favorite subjects.
I'm not sure that Ramona Fricassou is indeed a grandmother, but she is from Colorado. And she is taking a stand on whether or not she has to fork over to the Department of Justice the keys that would be necessary to decrypt her laptop in litigation that is pending against her. She's invoked the Fifth Amendment and saying, you know what, this is against my right not to incriminate myself, and I don't have to give you my passwords. John, have you looked at this, and do you have any thoughts? There's a good piece by Declan McCullough over at CNET.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a fascinating issue and cutting edge, and there's really very little precedent on it. There's certain analogies, right, to the idea of, well, if you have a key to your safe, are you supposed to turn that over? And courts there have said yes. On the other hand, is this something different than a key to a safe? In a sense, forcing people to effectively give away the password is like giving away the translation to their coded work, and in that sense, it potentially is asking someone to speak in a way that could incriminate themselves. There are huge privacy issues here, and obviously, as more and more of our lives become documented on our computers, on our cell phones, we are effectively accumulating tons and tons of incriminating evidence. Who among us doesn't have some illegal activity on any of their instruments, whether it's a form of copyright infringement, whether accidental or not, it doesn't really matter. It's strict liability regime or something more serious. I think this is something that potentially implicates all of us, and far from being just an infringement nation, it could subject us all to being a criminalized nation, because we all have something. No one is perfectly beyond the law and totally obeys the law at all times, and so I think there are tremendous implications in this suit.
Right. Here, Ms. Fricassou has been accused of a mortgage scam, so that is pending against her. And I guess the problem is, with our life moving completely to these devices, if we're unable to provide evidence, or the government is unable to get at evidence on these devices simply because it's encrypted, it's completely hamstrung in being able to prosecute people who, in fact, may be guilty of things like mortgage scams. Evan, are you with me there?
No, I'm reading the Wikipedia entry for fricassee. It's a catch-all term used to describe a stewed dish typically made with poultry. With this whole issue, it's fascinating to me because it seems to be a place where it's like right there where the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment meet, in the Bill of Rights, this whole question of, whether or not you got to turn over these passcodes. And so the question you're asking is like the effectiveness of investigations that can be done if we're going to have all these concerns and all these obstacles in the way. My, intrinsic sensibilities go toward a very pro-defendant standpoint in this, and I can fall right in line with what Marcia Hoffman says. She's with the EFF. She says something very interesting in this piece that Declan McCullough wrote about this, is looking at turning over your passcode or whatever you need to turn over to decrypt this information is a testimonial act in and of itself. So very clearly it falls within the scope of the Fifth Amendment prohibition on self-incrimination. So that's just coming from my innate sensibilities, like I say. Doing the analysis as a court would may be something, it may have to come to some kind of different conclusion. That's why these very the word fundamental, I know that we all misuse that or overuse that so much, but this is just such a fundamental liberty and privacy issue that it makes it very scary if, we're thinking that we might not get the answers to these questions right because they're just so critical to the privileges, the rights, indeed, that we enjoy in this free society. So I hate to see it impede the efforts of law enforcement, especially when there are important interests at stake. I can always play the, I don't want to, have Al-Qaeda fly an airplane into my office building card. But at the same time, I can't let go of that real kind of strong civil liberty-centric view of all this stuff.
Right. Kevin, in IRC, we've got Taffrin wanting to know how a password is not clearly analogous to the combination to a combination lock, and maybe it is. What do you think?
I certainly think that's part of it. In the EFF's brief that they filed, their amicus brief in support of Fricassee, they make the good point that giving it out, it's something that they know it would be testimonial for her to actually give the password. And it certainly could be similar to that. And I can also see the government's point that they need the ability to prosecute people in these days of whole disk encryption. If that's the way to get around federal charges is to go out and buy a copy of Norton or whichever that's got full disk encryption, and boom, you're good to go. That's certainly a problem.
Right.
So
when the government comes to your house with a warrant and has probable cause for that warrant, you're not able to stand there at your door and block them saying, I invoke the Fifth Amendment to you coming in my house. You're going to find things perhaps here that might incriminate me. That's why they're there. So,
right.
That's kind of where I come down on this, although, it's very rare for me to take a stance that seems to be counter to what good folks like the EFF have decided should transpire. So perhaps I need to take a closer look at my thinking on that one and look at it more carefully. One thing I'd like us to look at more carefully before we wrap the show is something that was posted to our Facebook page at facebook.com/TWiL. That was characterized as pure TWiL link bait, and I'd have to agree. This is something that Mike Masnick at TechDirt has been following and contributing to, I guess is the way to characterize it. Everybody no doubt saw last week when there were these wonderful kind of cute and campy meme-like pictures spreading around the internet of this macaque who had taken a picture of himself, I think it was a him, with a photographer's camera, and were published everywhere on the web, and they're so cute. There was a whole series of them. So Mike, being Mike, immediately began to think about that, go beyond the cuteness, if you will, to who on earth owns the copyright in that photo? It can't be the photographer because the picture was taken by the monkey. And it can't be the monkey because a monkey can't have a copyright. So he did a post on this and showed the pictures, and maybe we can show them as we discuss it too. And then there we go. There's our little friend, the macaque, taking a self-portrait. But
That's
then Mike hears from the people who, the whole point of Mike's post was the funny thing about this, and this is a classic, law student exam type question, so I'm glad we can bring it up for John's benefit. The thing about these photos is there can be no copyright because they were taken by a monkey. And yet he, without giving any sort of pause or actually having read his article on that point, apparently, Mike gets a polite, not a take now notice, but a brief letter from the news agency that purports to hold the rights to these uncopyrightable photos, asking him to take the photos down from his site. So let's let our law professor chime in on this one.
This is great. This could give nightmares to my students. I mean, it's the perfect makings for an exam, right, where all the copyrighted works are created by animals of different sorts. There's obviously a fascinating, almost existential issue of authorship here, right? To what extent can a non-human engage in the act of authorship? Something we typically attribute to humans, but often, people sell cat paintings or elephant paintings, and those are seemingly seen to be a form of authorship. It goes back to the statute. It even goes back to potentially what the Constitution says on this issue. There are some arguments that could be made for the news agency. I was thinking about this. If they want to get creative, they can go outside of the realm of copyright. So presumably, authorship, if we say, is we take a stringent view, it would be a natural person or a corporation, neither of which the monkey qualifies for. So presumably, the work isn't copyright protected. But arguably, the news agency could say, well, there's a term of use to the use of our works, and depending on what they put on their website, that term of use can create a contract that can be governed by state law. It may be preempted under the Copyright Act. It may not. But arguably, they could say that under their terms of use, it says you can't use any image on here, whether copyrighted or not, from our website. And so they may have a contract claim. That's one creative way they may be able to get around this. They may also, and I know in this particular case, the monkey actually took the camera himself or herself, right, and actually took the photograph. So there wasn't a claim of joint authorship by the photographer. But let's say the photographer helped put the settings on the camera and decided some aspect of the camera, the particulars. That may be enough, sufficient to create a joint work of authorship between the monkey and the human, and therefore they may have an argument this is a copyright protected work in which the human owns a 1/2 interest. So that's another argument that can be made. But again, this is all very theoretical. However, once you start getting a polite cease and desist letter sent, it could raise the realm of an actual case or controversy that someday may end up in courts as things go forward. It also has a whole animal rights angle to it, too, so it's fascinating.
Right. And Twits Ayaz Akhtar in IRC wants to know who owns the monkey, which may well be a pertinent question here.
Yes.
Kevin, any monkey thoughts?
Well, we were banding this about the office the other day, trying to see if there was any potential copyright ownership whatsoever, and none of us could think of one. The photographer didn't set this up. He didn't leave the camera out, for the monkey to take. He didn't, otherwise engage in any creative form, with the actual taking of the photograph. I mean, he owns the camera, that's for sure. Right. He owns the digital bits, the actual file. But in terms of a copyright interest, we just don't think he has one.
Evan, any different spin on this?
I'm just glad it's a story about a photo of a macaque that doesn't involve Anthony Weiner. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, exactly. and was texted to no one, as far as we know. All right, with that quick giving of our resource of the week, which is a wonderful answer to being sent to copyright school by YouTube or an ISP. Public Knowledge held a contest for a fair use education video to be the counterpoint to the one that YouTube has put up there for everyone to enjoy, and I use that term rather loosely. And there is a great fair use education video advocating for what your fair use rights are, and if you are on the wrong end of a DMCA takedown notice, how you might go about exercising your counter notice rights. So I do invite you all to go check a look over at Public Knowledge and look at the Fair Use School video, and perhaps it might be useful if you are someone like Mike Masnick and have engaged in fair use of something that is arguably copyrightable, if only loosely so. Maybe you'd like to send them a link to this video and it can help the discussion. And finally, our tip of the week is to go take a look over at Gizmodo, where there's a great post that says, "I flunked my social media background check. Will you?" It highlights a company called Social Intelligence HR, which I presume you can retain for lots and lots of money to do background checks. And one of the writers over at Gizmodo went ahead and had it check him, Matt Honan, just to see what would come up. And it's a really interesting article because some things came up that you know, could be problematic, but the overall takeaway that I got from him was there was a lot more out there. He said it helped to have a broad internet footprint that that never came up in the background check, including a tweet like the following never occurred in the check. "Glad I am childless, would not want a socialist black man telling my kids to work hard and not do drugs. Related, am so goddamn high right now," which of course he posted with the highest of irony, but if that were to come back to you in a background check from employment purposes, that might well lose you your job. So it's a great examination of all kinds of nuances of this, including the things that these services cannot provide, like an indication of your race or gender, for example, because if you're not hired for reasons like that, that is something that can give rise to a claim for hiring discrimination. So it's a really fascinating article, and I guess the tip is just to know that these services exist, and also that they may not function in exactly the way either the employer or you would anticipate, so be aware of them. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of This Week in Law. I really appreciate our great panel joining us today. John, it's a pleasure to meet you, another Southern Californian with social media and technology law and IP law interests and passions. Always fun to come across you. Michael Scott has been on our show before, also from your law school. Are you familiar with Michael?
Actually, I don't know Michael. Well, no, I do know. You're talking about my new law school. Yes,
yes,
I just
your new
changed
law
from. Yeah. Sorry, I was thinking of Chapman. Yes, absolutely. Yep. And I wanted to thank you for having me on the show. It's a real delight and a very fun discussion.
Really fun. So, folks, you need to go out and get Infringement Nation. The Amazon review on that is just amazing. I just want to read a couple of lines to give you the tease for this book. Drawing upon both theory and the author's own experiences in various high-profile copyright infringement suits, Tehranian supports his arguments with a rich array of diverse examples crossing various subject matters, from the unusual origins of Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, the question of numeracy among Amazonian hunter-gatherers, the history of standoffs at papal nunciatures, and the tradition of judicial plagiarism, to contemplations on Slash's criminal record, Barbie's retroussé nose, the poisonous tomato, flag burning, music as a form of torture, the smell of rotting film, William Shakespeare as a man of the people, Charles Dickens as a lobbyist, Ashley Wilkes' sexual orientation, Captain Kirk's reincarnation, and Holden Caulfield's maturation. If that doesn't get you to want to read this book, I don't know what will. And I am certainly looking forward to it, and I really appreciate your insights and contributions today, John.
My pleasure. Thank you so much again.
All right. And Kevin, it's always good to have you back at our show. Where can folks find you when you're not busy joining us here on TWiL?
Well, the blog is at cyberlawcentral.com, but I'm probably more often over on Twitter. My username there is cyberlaw.
And you're Kevin Thompson on Google+, correct?
That would be me.
All right. That's where I'm going to be finding you these days. And Evan, of course, blogs at internetcases.com and practices law at Hinshaw and Culbertson in Chicago. Any final thoughts for us today, Evan?
No, thanks for having me. It's a great conversation. Kevo, it's always good to talk with you. We're old pals. We go way back. I used to work over at Kevin's firm. And John, great to meet you. Really have enjoyed the conversation, and I am going to go pick up a copy of the book. So thanks. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Evan. Great to meet you as well.
Right on.
Thanks, everyone. You can tune in next week live at 11. We record 11 PDT, 1800 UTC at live.twit.tv. Meantime, send me emails. I'm Denise at twit.tv. Let me know what's going on. I always post up at Facebook and Google Plus and Twitter before the show, so you can hit me on all of those forums if there are specific things on your mind we should be paying attention to or discussing. We love hearing from you. And we'll look forward to that in the next week and see you for next week's episode 121 of This Week in Law. Take care.